the way Singapore had designed its source of wealth and fortune is by mortgaging its sovereignty to the United States. So once your sovereignty is mortgaged to the United States, then you will be in big trouble in a multipolar world. Is that why in recent times there's a talk of Singapore joining BRICS? And would the BRICS country be comfortable with Singapore that is mortgaged to US interests? Now, that is something for the future.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan, and every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first 30 minutes here on YouTube and the full episode for free on Patreon. So please just join our Patreon. We're trying to diversify our platforms just in case something happens to this channel. And also, if you want to make a donation, just know that it will go to covering our costs. It is also a podcast, so on Saturdays, it will be available as an audio and transcript on Patreon and as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music. Today, we have a special guest originally from Singapore, Wah Piow. He is a Singaporean political exile and human rights lawyer, now based in the UK. He served as president of the University of Singapore Students' Union in 1974, and after seeking asylum in 1976, earned his law degree at Oxford. Today, he advises refugee rights organizations and campaigns against authoritarian detention practices. In 1987, during Singapore's Operation Spectrum, his Singaporean citizenship was revoked. That's a bit of a mouthful. Sorry about that. Welcome, Wah Piow.
Hi, thank you very much, Ileana. And you are taking me back to 1987, the so-called Marxist conspiracy. To even talk about that, I have to go back even further. But I'm not going to bore the audience, which may or may not be familiar with Singapore politics.
Well, we'll just say like that in 1987, you were actually named by Singapore as the mastermind of the Marxist conspiracy to topple the Singaporean government.
Right.
So can you briefly explain how all that came about?
Yes.
Because we don't, it's quite complicated. And just what actually shaped your worldview? Like, what is your worldview? Are you actually a Marxist rebel that wants to topple the Singaporean government?
Okay, I'll come to that slowly. But for some who are not familiar with Singapore, the idea of a modern city-state with one of the highest per capita income in the world has a alleged Marxist movement with the audacity to set up a Marxist state would sound like a joke. But firstly, it is not a joke. There was such a allegation, and this, as you can see, was the headline of the Asia Week magazine. And these are one of the newspaper headlines during that period. Now, 1987 was a time for Lee Kuan Yew to plan his ultimate political transition. A scheme was hatched, and the scheme that was hatched was to weed out potential challenges to those who could be from previously student movement background or from social work background or from the Christian activists. Now, one must remember that Singapore is a very controlled state and hardly there are any political dissents. So, to put it in context, a scheme was hatched to get rid of potential threats to his future successors. And in the pipeline, one of the eventual successor would be Lee Hsien Loong, his son, who later on after Goh Chok Tong became the prime minister. So that is the plot, if I may put it that way.
Just to clarify that, are you saying that Lee Kuan Yew used the anti-communist campaign? It was a Washington-led anti-communist campaign waging across the world. Was he using that as an excuse to get rid of potential political dissidents?
Right? No, he was riding on the Cold War vocabulary of using communism, Marxism to threaten the population into dissociating with people who dissent against government policy. And in order to get rid of the 22 social activists and many others who were supporting them from the political scene, he need a legal excuse. They have not committed any crime, so he had to use detention without trial, which is the Internal Security Act.
But what were they actually demanding from him at the time?
Oh,
Or what were you as well?
no, I was at the time in 87 already an exile.
Okay.
I was student leader in 1974, thrown to jail on the come up charge. But because there is name recognition, they need a bogeyman. And in 1974, I became very famous because he put me on trial on the frame up charge. I defended myself. It went on for 47 days. So they have created a bogeyman at the time. In 1974, I was thrown in jail. I had to leave Singapore, came to UK for exile. By 1987, I was actually reading law at the Balliol College in Cambridge. But between that period, between the time when I was a student activist to when I went to Oxford in 1987, a few things happened. Because of the student movement in 1974, there was a follow-up movement, although much smaller, individual groups and so on, because you can't really organize and form organizations without government scrutiny. But there are these individual groups of people who were associated with me. Many of those who were arrested had nothing to do with me. I've not even met them, nor they have met me. But there are some Singapore students who were studying in London in the late 70s and early 80s, and that, for that matter, included the present president of Singapore. He too was called up for interview for a number of days, although he was not officially arrested under ISA. So you have these individuals which Lee Kuan Yew recognized as a potential threat. And in order to group them together and detain them, a story has to be told. And that is a story called the Marxist conspiracy.
Are you a Marxist? Would you characterize your worldview as Marxist?
Analytically, Marxism offers a structural analysis which I am familiar with and warm to. Even as an architecture student, even in this country, many architecture schools for the first term would require their students to read The Conditions of the British Working Class, written by Engels, the collaborator to Karl Marx. So Marxism as a analytical tool is something which I adopt, and I find that very useful. Whether I am advocating communism, which is associated with Marxism, is a separate issue. But the fact was that when I was in Singapore, even as a student leader, we were integrating our student movement with the workers in Jurong. In fact, it was this connection that got me into trouble, because we were trying to expose the control of the trade union movement by the ruling party. So by that, they would regard it as a Marxist, someone with Marxist tendency. And as for my worldview, 1960s, late 60s, early 70s was the period where I started developing a worldview. And that was also internationally a period of student revolt, a period of questioning the establishment, whether it is in China during the Cultural Revolution, or in Paris with the student movement, or the London LSE. In Singapore and in Southeast Asia, there was also an emergence of such movement. In the Philippines, in Thailand, 1973, they overthrew the government through student uprising. So it was a period where any young person, and I was then in my early 20s, was involved with that intellectual thinking process, and that's how I formed my worldview. I formed my worldview not in the ivory tower, but by engaging myself with the workers, and among those whom I work with are also social workers in Jurong, which was the industrial center of Singapore at the time. So that formulates my, or more my worldview based on what I see as unfair in society. So when it comes to the Marxist conspiracy, was there a Marxist conspiracy? No. Was there an attempt by those individuals to question what was going on? The answer is yes. But being the mastermind of anything, I was not. Although when some of them were in London with me, we were members of quite an active student organization and managed to build up a core of activists, not just among Singaporeans, but Malaysians as well. And that was what Lee Kuan Yew was very unhappy about.
Now, of course, like since Lee Kuan Yew's passing, he has been greatly canonized by the West. But you actually wrote an article entitled "The Canonization of Lee Kuan Yew Should Be Condemned." Lee Kuan Yew is even held up as a model to emulate by most of Western media, even prompting Berkshire Hathaway legendary vice chair Charlie Munger, considered Warren Buffett's right-hand man, to call him the greatest nation builder probably that ever lived in the history of the world, and suggested that China's success came from emulating Singapore. Since that's a pretty common sort of sentiment in Western media, that Singapore is the model Asian country, basically, and that all other Asian countries want to be like Singapore. Could you expand on what you're saying?
That article was written in, I believe, 2015, the year when Lee Kuan Yew passed away. And in fact, when he passed away, I wrote two articles. One was that was published in the Globe in Asia. And the second article I published, and that title itself speaks for why I was against canonization is that the death of Lee Kuan Yew would set the people free. Free from what? Free from fear. Fear of what? Fear of being detained without trial. Fear of what? Fear of losing your job should you be working for the government service. Fear of what? If you are working in the private sector, fear that some agents from the police would come to whisper into the ears of your employer that so and so should be sacked. Now, these are not hypothetical matters. These are matters that happened to my friends. And some of them at the university was unable to hold on to any job since they graduate. So they ended up as tuition teachers for a major part of their lives, and they are still living. So there is no doubt that Lee Kuan Yew had contributed to the progress of Singapore. He did change the hardware, but it was never a fishing village. By 1950, in the 1950s, there was already a very big group of entrepreneurs in Singapore. It was a modern city state, although he took it further and built public housing and so on, and brought in education and so on. Those were no doubt his contributions. But the myth that the Singapore model can be replicated anywhere in the world is something which those commentators, even politicians, misunderstood Singapore. Singapore is a city state. Its area is, I believe, about less than 50% of the land area of Singapore. But how did Lee Kuan Yew manage to make it so efficient such that if they are planning to be done, there would not be any protest, it would not be delayed. Politicians need not be inconvenienced by opposition voices in parliament, and that was by capturing the Singapore state. And how did he manage to capture the Singapore state? That was to arrest, to imprison, to exile. Hundreds and thousands were suffered under that. And as a result, within a decade, Singapore became a political desert. A political desert such that by the time I went into Singapore University, there was no opposition in parliament. The press came under his control. The courts came under his control. Even the judge, Sinature, who presided over my case for 47 working days, on the very first day of the trial, before even I started defending myself, he told me, you can take any complaints you want to the Court of Appeal in due course. And that is the way Singapore was run and continue to be run because the state was captured by the ruling party. Lee Kuan Yew captured the state. Now, is that model applicable in any other countries? The answer is no. Because in many other countries, the society are more pluralistic. Singapore is homogeneous. Being a small island state, it's easy for Lee Kuan Yew to control every household. And that is, in short, why at the time I wrote about condemning any attempt to canonize Lee Kuan Yew, not in the religious sense or whatsoever, is that once you put someone as an icon, you will shut out all debates about the policies during his time. And what did he add to Singapore? He added to Singapore public housing, education, and so on. But what he took away from Singapore were constitutional rights that existed even before independence. For example, we at the Student Union, at the time in 1974, we have a student union that was guaranteed by the Constitution. The student union draws a certain percentage of the tuition fees paid by the students. The student union had a building. The student union even have a van. So these were things which were rights entrenched within the law. But Lee Kuan Yew took that away, in the same way as the right to print, to publish, although controlled, but he took those away, strengthened the control. And that is the reason why I push the point that we should stop this talk about canonization.
But just to expand on 2 points, the one point is Singapore is a city state, and the other thing is the myth that you're saying about Singapore being a fishing village in 1950. I mean, it was a British colony until 1946, and then it wasn't necessarily a fishing village. It was already a port, right, for British interest in that region. So when we say that it was a city state, some people call it a corporate state. I've also heard of it as a tax haven for foreign interests. Can you expand a little bit more on that? Because some people are going to think it just means a small country that's run like a city.
All right. Okay. It is actually, when I use the term city-state, I need to elaborate. Because of its position, Singapore is not an agricultural society because of its size, but because of its position and its role as an entry port. Goods passes through Singapore. Trade goes through Singapore, through the ports. And now money is laundered through Singapore. Because of its tax haven, once the Prime Minister said all we need is to have 10 billionaires living in Singapore, coming from abroad. And that by they spending the money in Singapore, bringing their billions into Singapore, Singapore would be able to gain, say, from stamp duties when they buy properties and so on and so forth. Not every country have that advantage and is unique to Singapore, partly because it is not just a tiny little island out of nowhere. It is positioned at a place where you have Malaysia, you have Indonesia, palm oil, timber, lots of trades going on. Even the very rich that wants to store their ill-gotten wealth, instead of sending it to Switzerland or Luxembourg, they will deposit that in Singapore, where there's hardly any transparency. Could the population in UK allow such kind of opaque system to exist if England is to be Singapore on the Thames? Of course not. So it's for that reason that not many people understand how Singapore becomes such a rich country. And no doubt Singapore also exists at the time of the Cold War. And don't forget that the Vietnam War, the Korean War, Singapore benefited massively by servicing United States, even from the R&R, rest and recreation, apart from being a center for spying and so on in Southeast Asia, and ideologically Singapore was closely linked to the United States. Maybe now, maybe slightly different, but later I'll come on to it. It is still very much linked DNA to the USA.
Yeah, that's something that's really interesting this year, I think, because we've seen some really impactful shifts on a geopolitical scale. And that can be reflected very much so in the recent military parade held in Beijing. Xi Jinping's speech was reminiscent of the Bandung spirit, I think. Maybe you would agree. It referenced multilateralism and sovereign equality. Now, in light of, like we were saying, Singapore's position in that strategic position in Southeast Asia, the Changi Naval Base is a joint US Singapore naval base in Singapore. And Singaporean troops train with the US military and IDF. Can you expand on this? Where does Singapore go and how does it navigate the rise of the global south and the potential, some would say inevitable, move towards multipolarity?
Right. Firstly, we have to go back a bit into history and into history in the post-war period after the Second World War. What was the view of USA towards Singapore? And during the period after the war, Singapore had a very vibrant political movement made up mainly of workers and students. They were part of the anti-colonial movement because Singapore, as you say, rightly, it was a British colony. And the period that we are talking about post-war was also the period where we saw the liberation of China under Chinese Communist Party or Communist Party of China. There was substantial support for the cause of the liberation, and that evolved quite naturally because if you recall during the Second World War, the number of people executed by the Japanese invading forces was well over 5,000. Some put it into tens of thousands. And why were so many Chinese in particular executed in Singapore during the Second World War by the Japanese? It was because they were giving great financial support to the anti-Japanese war before it started. In fact, Japan invaded China even in the 1930s, and by the 40s, there were strong movement supporting the cause of the anti-Japanese war, which was led partly by the Communist Party. So there was this link, and United States at that time saw it as a threat to its geopolitical interests. And the interesting thing is when Singapore became independent from Malaysia in the 1960s, a CIA memorandum that was in August 1965. It was issued after Singapore left Malaysia, and it judged that Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew would remain staunchly anti-communist and cooperative with the West. Now, this is at the time of birth of Singapore. The eyes of the CIA was very much on the island state because there was fear that it could resemble a Cuba. And don't forget also, that was the time soon after the end of the Korean War. That was the time of the Vietnam War. That was also in the 60s, the time of a very strong nationalist left-wing government under Sukarno, the legendary president of Indonesia. And he was seen as a thorn. And we all know that the CIA was involved in getting rid of Sukarno and so on. So the Cold War was real. Now, 60 years since then, by the time last month or this month, when Beijing organized its huge military parade, spectacular by any standard, it was a message that Beijing was sending to United States in particular, to United States allies, that never again would China allow its sovereignty to be compromised. Now, today is a completely different geopolitical reality. A geopolitical reality where United States unilateral role as the self-appointed security chief for the world is now being challenged, and multipolarity is a reality. How would Singapore now tip through all these problems? Now, one interesting indication was the deputy prime minister was in Beijing, and he viewed the parade. He viewed the parade, but he missed the message, whether deliberately or otherwise. When he came back to Singapore, he wrote on his Facebook that China should look forward and not keep dwelling with its past. In exact words, he said, we must also look ahead and not be trapped by history. And now I wrote on my Facebook that certainly when he shook hands with Xi Jinping, he wouldn't dare to say that in his face. Now, but he missed that entire message. Was it because he was stupid? Or was it somehow sending this sarcastic remark as a message to the West to say that, oh, we are not buying the China or Xi Jinping story, and we are still your good friends? So that is how Singapore tried to balance its relationship in view of the superpower rivalry between China and USA, while at the same time trying to exist as though nothing have changed in a new multipolar world. Now, one interesting fact to note is that at the start of the Ukraine war, United States, and followed immediately by Europe and so on, started imposing sanctions against Russia. The only Asian country which is not formally an ally of the USA partake in this sanction is Singapore. When you talk about Greater Asia, you're talking about Japan, you're talking about Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. These are the four countries that sign up to the sanctions. Singapore joined in, and I believe Lee Hsien Loong flew to Washington, and some noted for as long as 5 days. And why sanctions matters to Singapore? It is because Singapore as a commercial hub, as a financial hub, is closely linked to the USA. As a city-state, it makes its fortune as a financial platform for USA Inc. in Asia. Singapore financial hub status is inseparable from the US dollar clearing system. And so are the Singapore banks dependent on USA regulatory goodwill. Singapore sovereign wealth funds GIC, the Temasek, and insurers are heavily invested in US assets. And US investors and multinationals are the major part of Singapore foreign investor stock. So USA is consistently one of the top two sources of inward investment. Now, therefore, we can understand why it is pragmatic for Singapore to go to Beijing and come back and make some sarcastic remark for the years of the United States. The problem now, and only very recently, I think in the last few days, where United States is talking about getting Europe to impose 100% tariffs on China. And United States, if we start ratcheting up the encirclement of China, both militarily and financially, they could start imposing secondary tariffs. If once they impose secondary tariffs, it will be a very, very major problem for Singapore as a financial hub. Now, is there an option for Singapore? I have no answer to that question, because the way Singapore had designed its source of wealth and fortune is by mortgaging its sovereignty to the United States. So once your sovereignty is mortgaged to the United States, then you will be in big trouble in a multipolar world. Is that why in recent times there's a talk of Singapore joining BRICS? And would the BRICS country be comfortable with Singapore that is mortgaged to US interests? Now, that is something for the future. I cannot speculate on that. But we see now Singapore is taking an interest even in Latin America and so on. Is it to buy up more support in case it becomes a member of BRICS? We do not know. But that is something to watch.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.